What if the most consequential military decision of the 20th century was never made by a general at all, but by a president who trusted one man's instinct over every war plan ever written in Washington? In the spring of 1950, the world was changing faster than any intelligence briefing could capture. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in August 1949, China had fallen to Mao Zedong's communist forces in October of that same year, and the United States, still exhaling from the trauma of World War II, found itself staring into a new kind of darkness. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, sat in the Oval Office with the weight of a civilization on his shoulders, reading reports that most Americans would never see. He was a man who had authorized the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and against Nagasaki 3 days later, not without anguish, but without hesitation, because he understood that leadership sometimes demands choices that history will judge long after the man who made them is gone. Now, 5 years later, a new crisis was forming, and again, Truman would have to decide not what to do, but who to trust. The name that kept appearing in every serious strategic conversation was Dwight David Eisenhower, a man whose very presence in a room seemed to shift the temperature of any argument. And the question that would define the next chapter of American military history was not whether to fight, but whether to plan slowly and carefully, or to move with the speed that war demands before the window of opportunity slams shut forever. If this story already has you leaning forward, you are exactly where this channel wants you to be. Subscribe right now, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves real history, the kind that doesn't make it into textbooks. Drop a comment below telling us what you didn't know before watching, because your perspective matters and we read every single one. The Korean Peninsula had been divided at the 38th parallel since September 1945, an artificial line drawn not by geography or culture but by the brutal arithmetic of Cold War politics. The United States occupied the South, the Soviet Union the North, and for 5 years both sides watched each other with the particular tension of two dogs separated by a fence they both suspect is weaker than it looks. Kim Il-sung, the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the North, had been meeting with Joseph Stalin in Moscow as early as March 1950, seeking approval and material support for a military offensive that would, he believed, reunify the peninsula under communist rule before the Americans could react. Stalin gave his blessing, calculating that the United States would not intervene, a miscalculation that would reshape the entire Cold War. On June 25, 1950, at 4 a.m. local time, the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel with approximately 90,000 troops, supported by Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks that the lightly armed South Korean forces had absolutely nothing capable of stopping. Seoul, the capital of the Republic of Korea, fell in 3 days. The speed of the collapse was staggering. The South Korean army, trained for defense rather than mobile warfare, disintegrated under pressure, and the government of Syngman Rhee fled southward in panic. The news reached Washington on the evening of June 24, American time, and within hours Truman had made his first critical decision. The United States would respond, and respond immediately, without waiting for a formal declaration of war. Truman's decision to intervene in Korea without a congressional declaration of war was itself a radical act, one that he justified through the authority of the United Nations Security Council, which had passed Resolution 82 on June 25, calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities. The Soviet Union, which could have vetoed the resolution, had been boycotting the Security Council since January 1950 in protest over the refusal to seat Communist China, an absence that would cost Moscow dearly and haunt Soviet diplomacy for decades. Truman authorized the use of American air and naval forces on June 27 and ground troops on June 30, committing the United States to a war it was structurally unprepared to fight. The American military in 1950 was a shadow of its 1945 self. The Army had shrunk from over 8 million soldiers at the end of World War II to fewer than 600,000, and the divisions stationed in Japan under General Douglas MacArthur were under strength, undertrained, and equipped with weapons that had already become obsolete. MacArthur, then 70 years old and commanding in the Pacific as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in occupied Japan, was the first American general to receive command of the United Nations forces in Korea, appointed on July 8, 1950. He was brilliant, theatrical, and deeply difficult, a man who confused his own legend with military reality, and who believed that his long experience gave him an authority that superseded not just military doctrine, but sometimes civilian oversight itself. The early weeks of the Korean War were catastrophic for American forces. Task Force Smith, the first American ground unit deployed to Korea, was a force of approximately 500 men from the 24th Infantry Division, rushed to the peninsula not because they were ready but because they were available. On July 5, 1950, near the town of Osan, they encountered the advancing North Korean army and were overwhelmed. Their weapons, including 2.36-inch bazookas, were largely ineffective against the Soviet T-34 tanks. They suffered heavy casualties, lost their artillery, and were forced into a chaotic retreat. It was a humiliating beginning, and it set the tone for weeks of desperate fighting as American and South Korean forces were pushed further and further south into what became known as the Pusan Perimeter, a rectangle of approximately 50 by 90 miles around the port city of Pusan in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. Inside that perimeter, the 8th Army under Lieutenant General Walton Walker held on with grim determination through July and August, fighting off repeated North Korean assaults while MacArthur, in Tokyo, was already thinking about something far more audacious than defense. He was thinking about Incheon. The port of Incheon, on the western coast of Korea near Seoul, had among the most treacherous tidal conditions of any harbor in the world. The tidal range at Incheon was among the greatest on Earth, sometimes exceeding 30 feet, meaning that for most of each day, the approaches to the harbor were shallow mud flats that would strand any landing craft attempting to reach the shore. The narrow approach channels were easily defended and could be mined. The sea walls at the port itself were high enough that assault troops would need scaling ladders to climb them under fire. Every naval and military expert who looked at the plan called it nearly impossible. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Omar Bradley, Admiral Forrest Sherman, General J. Lawton Collins, and General Hoyt Vandenberg, traveled to Tokyo in late July 1950 and sat across from MacArthur as he laid out his vision. The meeting on July 23 was one of the most extraordinary in American military history. MacArthur spoke for 45 minutes, pacing, gesturing, building his argument with the theatrical precision of a man who had been commanding audiences as much as armies his entire career. He argued that the very impossibility of Incheon was its greatest strategic asset, because the North Koreans would never expect an attack there, the element of surprise would be absolute, and a successful landing would cut their supply lines and trap the entire North Korean army between the landing force and the Pusan perimeter. The Joint Chiefs remained skeptical but did not overrule him. Truman, briefed on the plan, authorized it, and that authorization was itself an act of profound strategic trust. Operation Chromite, the code name for the Incheon landing, was scheduled for September 15, 1950, a date determined not by military preference but by the tidal tables, which offered only a narrow window of sufficiently high tide for landing craft to operate. The preparation time was extraordinarily compressed. From the moment serious planning began in earnest in early August, the operation had approximately 6 weeks to organize what would normally require months. The X-Corps, commanded by Major General Edward Almond, would conduct the assault with the 1st Marine Division under Major General Oliver P. Smith and the 7th Infantry Division. The Marines, who had fought across the Pacific in World War II, trained with fierce intensity for an operation that their own commanders privately questioned. General Smith, a meticulous and thoughtful officer, was deeply concerned about the planning timelines, the tidal conditions, and the lack of adequate reconnaissance. He pushed back on several operational details, insisting on modifications that he believed were essential to the survival of his men, and his caution would later prove to have been justified repeatedly throughout the Korean War. The naval component, commanded by Vice Admiral Arthur Struble, had to coordinate the movements of over 260 ships from multiple nations, assembling a force that had to arrive precisely on time to catch the high tide on September 15. The margin for error was essentially zero. And here is exactly the midpoint of this story, the moment where the human stakes become undeniable, where the question of speed versus planning stops being abstract and becomes blood and breath and the lives of 25-year-old Marines climbing sea walls in the dark. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it right now. Like this video, share it with a friend who respects real history, and leave a comment below. Tell us whether you think MacArthur's gamble was genius or recklessness, because that debate still has no easy answer and we want to hear yours. On the morning of September 15, 1950, at 6:33 in the morning, the first wave of Marines landed on Woolmedu Island, a small fortified island in Incheon Harbor that had to be captured before the main assault could proceed. The fighting was intense but brief. The island was secured in 45 minutes. Then the tide retreated, and for hours the fleet waited as the mud flats reappeared and the harbor went silent. In Tokyo, MacArthur watched from the command ship USS Mount McKinley with the particular stillness of a man who had bet everything on a calculation that could not be undone. At 5:30 in the afternoon, as the tide rose again and the light began to fade, the main assault went in. The Marines scaled the sea walls with ladders under fire, exactly as the pessimists had predicted they would have to, and fought street by street into the city of Incheon. The North Korean defenders, caught entirely off guard, offered resistance that was fierce in places but ultimately disorganized. MacArthur's central argument had been correct, the surprise was total, and the psychological shock to the North Korean command structure was profound. By September 19th, the Marines had pushed inland to link up with Army units, and by September 28th, Seoul was recaptured. MacArthur staged a formal ceremony in the damaged government house and declared the capital restored to Syngman-Rhee, a moment of theater that was vintage MacArthur, combining genuine military achievement with self-conscious historical stagecraft. The success at Incheon shattered the North Korean army as an organized fighting force. Cut off from their supply lines, outflanked from the north and hammered from the south by the breakout from the Pusan perimeter, which began on September 16th under Walton Walker's 8th Army, the North Korean divisions collapsed and disintegrated. Thousands surrendered, thousands more scattered into the mountains, and within weeks the force that had swept to the edge of the peninsula in summer was effectively destroyed as a coherent military organization. Truman, who had agonized over the decision to authorize such a compressed planning timeline, now faced the intoxicating pressure of total victory, and with it, the most dangerous question in all of military strategy. Where does success end, and where does overreach begin? The original United Nations mandate had been to restore the status quo ante, to push the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel and re-establish the border that had existed before June 25th. That goal was now achieved. But the momentum of victory, the emotional logic of war, and the particular ambitions of Douglas MacArthur all pressed in the same direction. North, into North Korea, toward the complete destruction of Kim Il-sung's government and the reunification of the peninsula by force. Truman, after consultation with the Joint Chiefs and Allied governments, authorized the crossing of the 38th parallel in late September 1950, a decision that would have consequences none of them fully foresaw. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai had been delivering warnings through neutral diplomatic channels since early October 1950, warning that if United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel and advanced toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Manchuria, China would intervene. MacArthur dismissed these warnings as bluff. At a meeting with Truman on Wake Island on October 15, 1950, MacArthur told the president that Chinese intervention was unlikely and that even if it occurred, American air power would make it a slaughter. Truman, who had made the trip across the Pacific specifically to assess MacArthur's judgment in person, came away reassured but not entirely convinced. He had seen enough of MacArthur's confident predictions to know that confidence and accuracy were not always the same thing. The Wake Island meeting was also significant for what it revealed about the civil-military relationship at the highest levels of the American government. Truman was deeply uncomfortable with MacArthur's public political statements, his correspondence with conservative politicians, and his occasional hints that he considered himself answerable to history rather than to the commander-in-chief. But Incheon had given MacArthur a prestige that made it politically almost impossible to restrain him, and so Truman restrained his own doubts instead, a decision that would cost him enormously in the weeks ahead. On the night of October 19, 1950, approximately 300,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, not officially the Chinese military, a legal fiction designed to limit the risk of direct superpower confrontation, crossed the Yalu River and entered North Korea in near-total secrecy. The operation was extraordinary in its discipline and concealment. Chinese troops marched only at night, hid in forests and valleys during daylight hours, observed strict radio silence, and were specifically ordered to avoid any action that would reveal their presence until the moment MacArthur's forces were fully extended and vulnerable. The first contact came on October 25, when South Korean units encountered Chinese soldiers and reported the engagement up the chain of command. MacArthur's headquarters initially interpreted these contacts as evidence of a small number of Chinese volunteers rather than a massive organized intervention. Then, on November 25, 1950, the Chinese struck in force along the entire front, an assault so powerful and so unexpected that it transformed the Korean War overnight from a campaign of liberation into a desperate fighting retreat. The 8th Army's right flank collapsed, and the disaster at the Chosin Reservoir, where the 1st Marine Division and elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division were surrounded by 12 Chinese divisions in temperatures that dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, became one of the most harrowing episodes in American military history. The retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, from November 27 to December 13, 1950, was 78 miles through mountain passes filled with Chinese soldiers and Arctic cold. The Marines under General Oliver Smith, the same careful, skeptical officer who had worried about planning timelines at Incheon, conducted what many historians consider the most disciplined fighting withdrawal in American military history. Smith's famous remark captured the spirit perfectly when he told reporters, "Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating, we're just attacking in a different direction." Approximately 15,000 Marines and soldiers who entered the chosen reservoir area came out through Hungnam, but they came out as a fighting force, not a broken rabble, and they brought their wounded and their dead. The cost was devastating. Roughly 4,000 killed, wounded, or missing among American forces at Chosin alone, with frostbite casualties adding thousands more. General Walton Walker was killed in a jeep accident on December 23, 1950, and was replaced by Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, who would prove to be perhaps the most important American military commander of the entire war, a man whose arrival in Korea marked a genuine turning point in how the war was fought and understood. And it was Matthew Ridgway who, more than anyone, represented the kind of careful, methodical, morally grounded military leadership that stood in contrast to the theatrical improvisation that had characterized so much of MacArthur's approach. Matthew Ridgway arrived in Korea on December 26, 1950, and immediately began assessing the condition of the Eighth Army with the brutal honesty of a physician examining a patient who had been misdiagnosed. What he found was an army that had lost confidence, not in its individual courage, but in its leadership and its mission. Ridgway believed that soldiers fight well when they understand what they are fighting for, and he began immediately to restore both tactical discipline and moral clarity to an army that had been shaken to its foundations. He moved among his troops constantly, wearing his distinctive 2 grenades on his harness, a habit he had developed in World War II and maintained as a kind of personal statement about proximity to danger. He also began a systematic offensive strategy designed not to capture territory but to destroy Chinese military strength through firepower, what became known as the meat grinder approach, which was brutal in its logic but effective in its results. By January 1951, Ridgway had stabilized the front. By March 1951, UN forces had fought their way back to roughly the 38th parallel. MacArthur, watching his vision of total victory evaporate, made a series of unauthorized public statements threatening China with expanded war, statements that directly contradicted Truman's diplomatic strategy and infuriated Allied governments. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of all his commands, replacing him with Ridgway in one of the most dramatic civil-military confrontations in American history. The decision cost Truman politically but was constitutionally and strategically correct, and history has largely vindicated it. And so we return to the question that opened this story. Why did Truman let Eisenhower, or more precisely, why did Truman trust the speed that MacArthur chose over 90 days of careful planning, and what does that choice tell us about leadership, about war, and about the terrible arithmetic of decisions made under pressure with incomplete information? The answer is not simple, but it is honest. Truman trusted MacArthur at Incheon because the alternative, refusing to authorize a bold operation and condemning the forces in the Pusan perimeter to possible destruction, seemed worse than the risk of attempting the impossible. The compressed planning timeline at Incheon was not a mistake in the context of September 1950. It was a calculated gamble that succeeded brilliantly. The mistake came later, when the success of that gamble was allowed to expand MacArthur's authority beyond what any civilian government should have permitted, when the warnings from China were dismissed rather than heeded, and when the momentum of victory was confused with the certainty of more victory. Dwight Eisenhower, who would succeed Truman as president in January 1953 and who had his own profound understanding of the relationship between speed, planning, and strategic patience, forged across the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, and across the fields of Europe in the months that followed, would inherit the Korean War as his first presidential challenge and end it through armistice on July 27, 1953, restoring essentially the same border that had existed before June 25, 1950. The war that Truman entered in 72 hours, authorizing intervention before anyone had a 90-day plan, ended where it began, at the 38th parallel, after 3 years, 5 million casualties, and lessons about the limits of military power that American strategy has never fully finished absorbing. This story is not just history. It is a map of how human beings make decisions under pressure, how leaders weigh speed against caution, how trust can be both the most powerful tool and the most dangerous vulnerability in any chain of command, and how the consequences of a single choice made in a crisis can cascade forward for decades in ways that no planning document could predict. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, forgotten because it was sandwiched between the undeniable moral clarity of World War II and the cultural upheaval of Vietnam. But it deserves to be remembered, because the men who fought it, from the Marines at Chosin to the soldiers at the Pusan perimeter, paid a price that history owes them the dignity of understanding. If this video moved you, challenged you, or taught you something real, please subscribe to this channel right now, give it a like, and share it with someone who cares about the truth of what happened and why it still matters. Leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most, whether it was the tidal conditions at Incheon, the Chinese crossing of the Yalu, the relief of MacArthur, or something else entirely, because the best conversations about history happen when people who actually pay attention get together and talk honestly about what the past is still trying to teach us.